Well, thank you for coming along. It's such a pleasure to be here in Southampton, and Southampton's a very, very important location for Starling Bank, and I'll tell you why. But first, my startup story. Yes, I'm a computer scientist, a chemist that started my career in banking in the early 80s. And I worked all over the world in all the banks. Lloyds Bank, Standard Chartered Bank. Then I did banking consultancy for PwC. Then I was in UBS in Zurich. Before my stint in insurance, before I joined ABN AMRO in the Netherlands and looked after their business across 34 countries, before joining RBS. Then the financial crisis happened and it wasn't my fault. And then I took a year out. And in that year, I realized that a lot of the things that I was absolutely 100% sure of were absolutely wrong. In a long career, in front office, middle office, back office roles in big banks all over the world, I thought the world looked one way. And I thought technology cost hundreds of millions, even billions. But whilst I was so focused on the day-to-day issues in banks, the world had changed. And post-financial crisis, I spent a year in the startup world, realizing that I was just out of date. That I thought it took billions to do things, whilst the world had moved on. There were cloud technologies, there were different techniques. And all of a sudden, I started using the skills I hadn't used for 10, 20 years. But banking wasn't out of my well, I still love banks. And one day, somebody phoned me up and said, would you want to join a bailed-out bank that had taken a huge amount of money from the EU post-financial crisis? Because they need somebody to turn it around. They need somebody to return it to profitability. And I couldn't resist. And I joined in 2012 Allied Irish Banks that had taken 40-odd billion of EU, IMF funding to rescue it after the financial crisis. And the financial crisis, 2008-2009, wrecked banks. But in Ireland, it had wrecked a country. And my job was to go into AIB to do the turnaround. And in that process, I went to villages and towns throughout Ireland and talked to customers. And it was painful. Banks had ruined the country. And I started dreaming about how things could be different, how banks could do good, and how technology had totally changed, but had not changed in banks. So I started dreaming of a different way of doing things. And I also dreamed about one day, when I'd done my stint, I usually do 4 or 5 years in a job, I'd do something different. I'd do a startup. I'd do something in banking. But I realized the only thing that I really wanted to do was to start a bank. But nobody ever starts banks. But in December 2013, I quit my job to start a bank. And January 2014, I came back to London and started knocking on doors in the city, law firms and consultancy firms, explaining my idea. And the idea was this. Every other industry had changed. Amazon had changed shopping. Spotify had changed music. But banking was still doing the same old thing. And I had an idea of a new sort of bank based on all new technology that had a full banking license, that would give people tools to manage their day-to-day money. And they'd be fair. They wouldn't rip people off. They wouldn't overcharge. And And I explained this idea, and people thought I was crazy. People thought it couldn't be done. But I eventually got one or two people to buy into the idea. Now, at that time, I thought to start a bank, you needed a minimum of 300 million. I'd come from big corporations, and we only did things in hundreds of millions. So I started going around trying to raise 300 million. And people would laugh at me. First of all, people don't start banks. And a woman in her 50s especially doesn't start a bank, especially a bank based on technology. But I convinced some people to buy into the idea. And I managed to convince KPMG to give me as much free resource as possible to get the idea off the ground. And then I convinced PwC that if they didn't help me, they'd be left out in this great idea. Then I didn't know much about marketing. So I started phoning people up and said, I need some help with marketing. But I don't know anybody in marketing. And somebody introduced me to Martin Sorrell. I think he knows a bit about marketing. And I begged and borrowed people to help me with this proposition because I couldn't raise money. I couldn't raise 30,000. I couldn't raise 100,000. People thought the idea was too far out. It would never actually happen. People don't start banks. I couldn't raise money, but I could raise the support of people. And my offices were the customer lounges of KPMG and PwC. I worked this theory that if I turned up at these offices, they wouldn't actually turf me out. And I spent a whole day having meetings in their customer lounges until eventually KPMG asked me to leave and I moved into PwC. But I put a team together to build this bank. And I remember the first meeting I had with the regulator in June 2014 and said, there's going to be this great bank. We're going to do it this way. This is how we're going to deliver the technology. And they said, you cannot build a bank in the cloud. And you're going to build the technology from scratch. You're actually going to have people coding. Yep. The first people we're going to hire are engineers. They didn't believe it. Anyway, we had a couple of false starts. We had people join us and people leave. And 2 years in, Starling was staffed by only people who were working for the cause, working for equity in the future. I paid the rent occasionally. I paid for the photocopying. I paid for the application for the Bank of England license. But the people working for us, working in the team, were all working for the vision. And every day, from about sort of middle of 2015, I'd go out to fundraise. And I'd turn up in a sort of investor office and do my pitch. And as I walked, out of the office, to the other side of town for the pitch, the people in the office would look up and say, keep our fingers crossed, you're going to come back with some money this time. And I did that hundreds of times. Until in November, and I'm trying to raise 3 million by then. I had a call in November, early November 2015, that somebody had read an article about me in Bloomberg magazine. And liked the idea of a bank that's going to do things differently, that's built on technology, that was going to use data for the benefit of the people owning the accounts rather than the benefit of the bank. And if you have all this data around every single transaction, and if you put it together, that would be incredibly powerful. And he read this article, and he was interested, and I'd never heard of him, so I didn't return the call. Because I was so convinced to go out every morning and meet an investor. Well, eventually, he convinced me to meet him. I flew to the Bahamas and met him, and I was trying to raise 3 million. And at the end of 3 days of asking me these detailed questions, and it was 3 horrific days of asking the most detailed questions, he said he wasn't going to give me 3 million. He was going to give me 48. And that was the biggest seed round in Europe ever. So all of a sudden I got money. So now we have to go into a different mode. We have to actually build this bank I promised, because they'd invested on a deck. Somebody had given me 48 million for a 48-page presentation. I don't think it was 50 pages, it's about 45, 50. $1 million a page. So now I had to deliver it. So the following day, we submitted the banking license. And we submitted the application of the banking license to the Bank of England. We were only the second bank to join the faster payments and the sterling monetary framework in 300 years. We actually delivered the application in 3 or 4 boxes stacked up above each other in a van. And the guys went off to deliver the banking license application. And when they got there, they were sent round the back to the delivery area because not used to having people come up physically with the banking application. They wouldn't take a submission by anything else. Anyway, that was 2016. We got our banking license. 2017, we launched into the app stores. And today, we have nearly 1 million customers and 1 billion in deposits. And we're about to start our journey all across Europe. But people ask me, what's the journey been like? How have I known how to conduct this entrepreneurship, this startup journey? I read a lot and I watch a lot. I read absolutely anything I can get my hands on about startup life. I watch absolutely anything coming out of Stanford about startup life. I read hundreds of books about how this world works. Because there's no easy way to actually pick up that knowledge. And what you learn in those books, some of which you can identify with, and some of which you have to dismiss as not relevant for you. But I've learned so much by trying to absorb that knowledge that big founders have written down in books. One of my favorite is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. And he talks about the peacetime, wartime CEO. He talks about running a company in tough times. And when things have been really, really tough, I replay those chapters time and time again. I listen to them in the car, I read them again and again. Because in a startup, the default is dead. The default in a big corporation is that you continue and you grow, or you roughly do 3 or 4% every year. The majority of startups fail. The majority of startups every year, it'll be their final year. And it's scary. And you're living on the edge. And that's why startups can change the world. Recently, in the banking world, a lot of the big banks have decided that to compete like people like us, they have to do flanker brands or speedboats, little organizations off the side, sometimes in a separate building. to create something new. And by creating this environment, perhaps they can innovate and create. And they tried to create that environment. They tried to create an environment which is brick walls and fun posters and free beers. But it's all phony. Because to create something that's really special, that's going to change the world, that's going to do something that's never been done before, you have to live on the edge, and it has to be scary, because when it's scary, you do your best work. How am I doing for time?
It's fine.
Okay, I'm good. Okay, fine. Now, my story now from 2017, 2019. We're now 700 people. We're going to be employing about 150, 200 people, even more in Southampton. And we're employing engineers. Okay, so that's a hint. Okay. We are building a capability in London, in Southampton, and Cardiff to actually do something that's never been done before in banking. Because we're building a bank that's going to use absolutely every transaction for our customers' benefit, not for the banks. We want to create a vision where we can tell people if they're spending too much, too little, if they've got enough money to the end of the week, the end of the month, the end of the year, to the end of their life. Because we believe that if we manage money better, if we allow people to have the tools to take all that stress going on in their head and let something else manage it, we can make people's lives less stressful, more fun, and we can be one of the first really useful banks. Now, before I sign off and go on to questions, I'm still an entrepreneur and I'm still a startup. And I'm still prepared to ask you to download the app. So you can do that now. Okay, thank you very much. I don't think it's the idea, it's the execution. I think there are lots of good ideas that never get implemented, and there are lots of people working on the same idea. I think the question is to get on and actually do it. You can always pivot. The market will tell you very, very quickly if that idea is a good one. Try it. You know, anything from putting a website up there and pretending you're actually selling something you even haven't made it, and somebody clicking on it will tell you whether it's actually wanted by people or not. Paul Graham says, make something people want. Try it. The market will soon tell you if it's a good idea or not. I think you measure success at different stages in the journey. I think success for me at the moment is not producing a bank that has millions of people, but changing an industry. If banks such as Starling are successful, the big banks will respond. They'll stop punishing for customers when they make a mistake. Banks will start to be fairer. So you can measure the success in lots of different ways. I'm measuring Starling's success and my success in changing an industry. But as far as in the early stages of your startup, you never really know if the metrics you choose in the early days are going to be the ones that are going to matter years later. And you'll have lots and lots of people telling you that your idea is not good enough, or you're never going to raise money. But if every single entrepreneur listened to what people were telling them, there'd never be any good ideas. You've got to keep on going. I think there's a whole movement of new banks changing an industry. A sign of something that's really important, really going to change the world, is there's more than one group working on it. And there's a whole movement now that's giving the big banks a run for their money. Well, my first employees weren't getting paid, so it's even tougher. Who were the first people? Let me just think. Okay, so this is how I did it. I started making lists of people I knew and figuring out which ones were available, which means weren't actually working, and could be convinced to work on this great idea. So I spent days and days and days going through LinkedIn, phoning people up, explaining to them that I got this great idea to start a bank. It's going to bank like no other. It's going to do all these things, and it's going to be, we'll have to work for years for nothing, but when we get there, it's going to be really awesome. And after a couple of weeks, somebody rang me up and said that he'd been awake all night thinking about the idea. And it was so compelling that he had to do it. And that's how we started our first people. I think trust is a difficult thing. What are you worried about with trust? You're worried about somebody running off with your idea? Don't, right? Because there's no way you can keep your idea just to yourself. You could be telling all these people. So if they run off with the idea, fine, right? It's execution that really matters. Trust, can you really spend all that time with that person? Do you like them well enough to be spending 24/7 working on an idea with them? I think that if you do not trust people, you're never going to get an environment where you're going to be working together to create something. And if you're worrying about trust, perhaps you shouldn't be in the startup world, because you have to be in it together and you have to trust until they prove you wrong. I think every day has been the same for the last nearly 6 years. I start in the morning and I send emails and I talk to people and I just can't keep on going. I think that you constantly have to chivvy people along. It's like keeping all the balls in the air all the time. You must make sure that you're working on the immediate, the mid-term and the long-term. And as a CEO, your job is to worry about the things that are going to be impacting the business in 6 months, 1 year's time that nobody else is thinking of. Because your team are working on the things they know about now and are impacting the business now. The CEO must look beyond that and start worrying about the things that are going to impact the business in a year's time. Okay, Lean Startup. I got so many copies of that. At different stages, Founder's Dilemma. One of the big things, early on in the set up an organization, you're trying to figure out how you're going to allocate equity. That's very good at that stage. Read all Paul Graham's essays. I'm not convinced about everything he says. Watch all Sam Altman's Stanford lectures on startups. Then, as you get more sophisticated, look at product books, and then as you go into the growth stage, high growth companies by Gill or blitzscaling. And once you tap into some of this knowledge, it's easy to find the next bit of knowledge you need. You sort of get into this Silicon Valley network of people starting businesses, and you can navigate it and find very, very interesting sources. I'm embarrassed by most of them, actually. I think the majority of startup founders coming out of Silicon Valley don't see the world the way we need to see it now. Silicon Valley is not diverse. Silicon Valley is full of people who look exactly the same. And I read all the biographies of all the startup founders, whatever. And if you look at lots of their work and lots of the books they're writing, all the newer editions, they've changed the slant slightly. So they've put in much more politically acceptable language. And some of them are reinventing themselves. But that's all quite controversial. But if you could ask me who my hero is, I don't have one. I think we're at a tipping point where we can grasp ideas and run with them. And historically, we haven't managed to do that. I'm building a bank in the UK, and all the engineering is done in the UK, and we build everything ourselves. And we can hire really, really good engineers. Looking back to my engineering career, when I started in 1980, we did everything in banks. We had technology departments, we coded, I coded. In the late 80s, we started offshoring and outsourcing. In the 90s, into year 2000, I was the first to do some of the big outsourcing contracts for the banking industry in the UK. I was known as the person who had slashed your IT budget, run down your IT department and move it all offshore somewhere. And in that process, we took the people who knew how to code and the people who created something for the business and put them further and further apart. And that was a huge mistake. And it meant that in many industries, the insurance industry, the finance industry, we lost decades of advancement. It was a huge mistake, and I caused many of those mistakes. It was me that was doing all of that. And I've come to the conclusion that that was wrong. And at Starling, we're engineering-led. And we do things in cooperation, in teams, and build things together. I think the UK can be the place that can lead the world on that. And I go all around the world talking to people about how the UK, how Starling is changing technology in the finance sector.